Hello, and welcome to the one of the many video casts with Rob Guzman. How are you doing today? I'm doing pretty well myself. So here we are at the beginning, or middle, I should say, of October. This is my 6th episode of this show. It's been going pretty well so far. I really enjoy doing these little video casts. And, I'm always receptive to people giving me feedback. So if there's anything you want to add to what I'm already doing, if you have questions for me from previous episodes, or if there's anything in this episode that I don't cover that you're interested in hearing about, feel free to comment or send me an email or a tweet. So I have a busy program for you today. I have 3 items I want to talk about. The first thing, just a quick announcement. As I had said last week, I'm going to be doing a debate on the Me Too movement. That's something that's now scheduled. It's scheduled for Wednesday of this week in New York City, Manhattan, at Meetup headquarters. So that is meetup.com's headquarters. I'll be debating one-on-one. It's going to be a 20-minute debate. They're doing a series of debates for the upcoming election. The 3 topics they're going to be doing are Me Too, I believe it's healthcare, and immigration. 3 big topics. I won't be doing the other 2 debates, but I have a good friend, Lewis, who's doing the healthcare debate, so I'll be watching him and egging him on, or not egging him on, but, rooting for him. He'll do the same for me. And, we'll be discussing Me Too, me and my opponent. So, looking forward to it. Should be a good time. I'll be putting that up on my YouTube channel and on my blog once that's done. So, if you're not in Manhattan, if you're not around to see that, you'll at least be able to see it on video. So, what do we have for you today? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is the disappearance of a journalist, a Washington Post columnist by the name of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, last week. So, if you haven't followed this story, it's all right. It's a developing story. It's interesting. So, Jamal Khashoggi is born in Saudi Arabia, was a Saudi citizen for a while, lived in London for a little while, moved to the United States, and was a resident of the United States, and was a fierce critic of Saudi Arabia. He was essentially, he went back to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul to retrieve documents for his marriage, his upcoming marriage. And what ended up happening is they have video of him going into the consulate and none of him coming out. No one knows what happened to him. He's missing at the moment. His fiancée, his wife-to-be, has no idea where he is. And the Turkish government, who is hostile to the Saudis, is basically claiming that the Saudis had him murdered, had him killed inside the consulate, and it was kind of a black bag operation, as they say, black bag. So this is garnering a lot of international criticism and outrage. Trump has been called upon to criticize the Saudis harshly and to pull back funding from them. We, as the U.S. government has been allied with Saudi Arabia for many years, and we gave them, when Trump became president, we completed a sale of $100 billion arms deal to Saudi Arabia. We've done similar deals with them in the past. And every president for the last 30 to 40 years has been going to Saudi Arabia to visit. Obama did this, Bush did this. They all bow to the Saudi king. I mean, there's video of Trump dancing with the Saudi king. There's this funny picture of him and the other Saudis putting their hand on this globe. And, a lot of the leftists would tweet about how this was them trying to control the world and everything. It's all fun when it's on Twitter and you're making fun of it. But these are real tyrants, these people. These Saudis are a theocratic government. So Saudi Arabia is ruled by the House of Saud. It's a family, it's a lineage, it's an absolute monarchy that has, as part of its legitimacy, a claim to the throne of Saudi Arabia because it claims custody and protection of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which are sacred in Islam. Now, the Wahhabi sect of Islam is radical. It's opposed by regimes like Iran, but it's a nasty ideology. I mean, these people fund mosques and madrasas all over the world, in Europe and the United States. They are funding radical jihadist ideology. They despise Western values, and they treat their women very harshly. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, if you commit blasphemy, they flog you in public. If you steal something, if you're guilty of theft, they chop off your arm. I mean, this is like real Code of Hammurabi stuff. And apostasy, which is renunciation of Islam, is punishable by death in Saudi Arabia. So this is terrible. Women in Saudi Arabia cannot leave their home alone without a male guardian. It can be a brother, it could be a son, it can be a husband or a father, but they can't actually leave the house without guardianship of their male guardian. And this is, of course, really brutal on women. They can't really live a life of their own. They have to basically live by the permission of their male guardians. So in the show notes for this, I'll post a nice essay written by Ilan Journo at the Ayn Rand Institute, who does a lot of public policy work and analysis. And he basically goes over the abuses and the nasty ideology of the Saudi regime. Now, there are people saying Trump isn't doing enough to attack Saudi Arabia. I would put myself in that category, but I don't think Saudi Arabia is as bad as Iran, for example, which I think Iran publicly attacks the U.S., publicly claims they're going to annihilate us, fight us, all this stuff. They took hostages from America. The Saudi family is a little more cowardly. They're a little more venal. They're a little more motivated by money, I think. And I think they're radical Islamists, but I think that they are a little smarter than the Iranians in that sense. But regardless, I think the Saudi Arabian regime is a real menace to the American image. I think we should not be their ally. And I'm with Rand Paul when he says we shouldn't be dealing arms deals with them. We shouldn't be giving them money for arms. And we shouldn't be endorsing their behavior and their regime's ideology by being their ally. I think that there's a pragmatic foreign policy that's been in effect for years, going back to at least the 70s, where we basically backed Saudi Arabia because we needed a foothold in the Middle East, and Israel wasn't enough for whatever reason. So I think that if you want to take a principle out of this, there's a couple principles you could take. One is you reap what you sow. I mean, this is a country that we're affiliated with internationally. That's one thing. And the second problem is look at this sort of brutal treatment of a journalist. I mean, somebody who was a critic of the Saudi regime was lured there by the government, murdered, as far as we know. We don't really know. Disappeared, as they say, maybe in 1984. And similar things have been done by brutal thugs all over the world. I mean, a few months ago, or maybe it was last year, Putin, the Russian regime, sent people to murder journalists in Britain. There's a lot of public outcry about that. And in Central and Northern Europe, similar things have happened in I think it's Poland and Hungary, countries that are essentially becoming more authoritarian. And we know that China does similar things with journalists that are hostile to their regime. So this is a trend, and it's something that's becoming more common because the United States is not the ideological bastion of freedom that it once was. It's moved more and more in the direction of socialism, more and more in the direction of a mixed economy. And so we lose some of our moral credibility and moral standing in the world, and fewer regimes are, more regimes are willing to risk our ire. We're basically, as the Iranians said after the revolutions in '79 when they took our hostages, they called us a paper tiger then, and I think that their estimate was right. We are a paper tiger, and until we take the gloves off and actually fight this ideology, the Wahhabi, Iranian, ISIS, all this sort of radical Islamist ideology, whether it's Sunni or Shiite, doesn't really matter ultimately. They agree on one fundamental, which is important, which is Western culture has to go, and Islam is the way to go. So I think we need to fight this ideologically and militarily, and we shouldn't be giving aid or money to Saudi Arabia. So we'll see where this goes. I don't anticipate us cutting off diplomatic ties to the Saudis anytime soon, although there's a lot of political pressure from this incident to do so. So stay tuned on that. Now, speaking of taking the gloves off, the second topic I want to talk about is a continuation of last week's topic on the increasing radicalism and violence of the American left. Now, this week, we've seen a few more instances of this, and it seems to have gotten worse since the last time I did my cast last Sunday. So, since last week, we've had two prominent figures, Eric Holder and Hillary Clinton, come out in the media and say things to encourage at least a mob mentality in their Democratic base. So Hillary, in an interview with Christine Amanpour, said that civility, having civil discourse between Democrats and Republicans, shouldn't be something we pursue until the Democrats win back either the Senate or the House. So basically, as long as they win, civility can happen. But until then, incivility is the rule of the day. At least that's what the implication of her statement is. Eric Holder, for his part, basically took what Michelle Obama said in 2016. If you recall, she said, when they go low, we go high. Of course, this was spoken at a time when the Democrats were in charge. So, of course, and they thought they were going to win that election and everything. So, all this sort of highfalutin, gracious victory kind of let's be civil. But you only see this in the Democrats when they're winning. But when they're losing or when they're on the defensive, the truth comes out. And Eric Holder said, when they go low, kick them. That's right. Just kick them. Just fight them to the death. I mean, you have to understand what this is. I mean, this isn't just some guy at a party making a lewd statement. It's not some nobody. These are officials in the Democratic Party who are basically the ideological bastion of this organization. Holder was Obama's attorney general. There's talk about him running for office in the future. Hillary was the Democratic presidential candidate in 2016. She wasn't a nobody. And she still isn't a nobody. She won't go away, but she still has a really important voice in the Democratic Party. So when these people come out and say civility isn't needed, kick them if they go low, I mean, this is violent imagery. It's dangerous. It's going to stoke violence. I mean, a few years ago, it was 2017, Representative Steve Scalise, a Republican, was shot at a baseball game, an collegiate baseball game. He was actually shot by a leftist who claimed that this is for healthcare. That's what he yelled after he shot Steve Scalise on the baseball diamond. Similarly, you've got here in New York City this last Friday, more violence. There was this Republican Metropolitan Club in Manhattan, near where I live, 82nd Street, up in the Upper West Side. And what ended up happening was this building was vandalized, and there were anarchy signs painted on the doors, windows were broken, the electronic keyboard to get into the building was destroyed, and there was a threatening note that said something to the effect of, this is just the beginning, we're going to be continuing to harass you. And I mean, you've got people like Maxine Waters coming out and saying that, we need to heckle Republicans everywhere they are, Trump supporters shouldn't be safe. And, Mazie Hirono went on CNN and claimed in an interview with them that, with this whole Kavanaugh confirmation debacle, when they were heckling Ted Cruz and other people, other Trump supporters, like, what's her name? Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the press secretary. When these people are accosted in public, Hirono would refuse to denounce that. She said, well, these people get into it, they get heated, and she basically echoed what Holder and Clinton said, which is the gloves are off and we have to basically fight fire with fire. So this is very dangerous. It's very bad. Antifa was also another big story this weekend. They clashed with sort of right-wing group in Portland on Saturday. There was violence, pepper spray, baseball bats, the usual stuff from these people, from these thugs. Now, I will say this. I'm against violence from both sides. But I am also of the mind that there's a difference when one initiates aggression against the other. If you are a group and you have a permit to do a march or do a gathering, that has to be respected. If you're going to allow people to convene and give permits out, you have to do that for everybody. You can't just say that it's okay for the left, not okay for the right. And if somebody has a permit and then the other group comes with baseball bats and mace, they're the aggressors. They're the ones initiating force. Even if you think the ideology of the right-wing group is horrible, it doesn't matter. They still have a right as Americans to put out their message. If you're going to allow it for one, you have to allow it for all of them. Now, we can get into the details here. I actually am opposed to public property generally, so this wouldn't arise in an objectivist or libertarian society. But while it does exist, while you have public property, you can't pick and choose, and you can't allow one group to intimidate the other. It's just not allowed. So we'll see where this goes. I think, again, I really don't like talking about this. I think it's, a lot of people don't even take it seriously. I mean, there are Democrats who will see this and say, why are you talking about this? This is meaningless. These are just a couple of thugs or a couple people taking it too far. Well, you have to understand that ideas matter. Okay, people are animated by ideas. It's not just this. You can't split facts and values and say that we can talk about facts, but values are meaningless or they're rationalizations for whatever people do. No, people act on their values. And if you've got people putting out ideas like violence is a value for people if they're losing an election, people are going to act on that, and you have to fight that with other values and other intellectual arguments. So, it's not meaningless. These are concretes. These are facts. And it's dangerous. And it's hypocritical of the left to do this, particularly now when, the Tea Party was a big and active force. There were claims that they were violent, even though there was very little to any violence put out by the Tea Party. So this is, not just the usual partisan charade. This is actually dangerous. This is mob politics. And that's the other thing. The media are in bed with the Democrats on this. They refuse to use the word mob. They call it the M word. I mean, people were saying, this is something that you're blowing out of proportion. It's not being blown out of proportion. This is mob tactics. This is intimidation, and it shouldn't be tolerated in a free society. So that's all I have to say about that. So aside from Saudi Arabia and the antics and violence of the left, what other things can we talk about? Well, here's an interesting topic that I want to finish this video with. It's a little longer of a topic because I have a lot to say about it. And that is there was this recent hoax perpetrated in academia. So when I say a hoax, an academic hoax, what happened was we had 3 researchers who published papers in these peer-reviewed, respected journals in what they call Grievance Studies departments. So Grievance Studies departments this is the term that authors of this paper use. These are things like women's studies, black studies, Native American studies, basically all of these sort of identity politics-oriented fields in academia. And it comes out of something called critical theory, which I'll get into in a second, where it gets that name and why it's philosophically significant. But what these 3 folks did, these 3 academics did, is they published 20 fraudulent papers, okay? Papers that aren't real, that don't have any real basis. And what they did was they tried to get them published in peer-reviewed, respected journals associated with these Grievance Studies departments. Now, the reasoning for this was they wanted to see how corrupt these fields were. They wanted to see what can we get away with. How rigorous are these journals? Do they believe these arguments that we're putting forward, even though we don't believe them? And what's their bar for entry into their journal? What's the limit? So, surprisingly, they got success. They had 7 papers that were accepted, okay, published in peer-reviewed journals. Fraudulent papers written by phony authors associated with phony institutions and containing complete nonsense, either claims that don't have data to back them up or just really ludicrous arguments. And I'll give you some examples in a second. But, they did that, followed by 7 papers. So 7 of the 20 were accepted, okay? 7 of the 20 were rejected, okay? So 14, that accounts for 14 of the 20. And what about the other 6? Well, they were still pending. And they were in various states of pending status, but for the most part, they were on their way to being published. Most of them had been through a couple of iterations with the editor. They had made the necessary changes the editor suggested, and they were awaiting a decision to be published or not. So let's say you want to be, fair-minded and say, let's say of those 6, 3 of them didn't make it and 3 of them made it. That would mean that you'd have something like half of the papers they published, fake papers, published in peer-reviewed journals associated with these Grievance Studies departments. So what does this tell you about these fields? Before we get there, let's talk about what these papers contained, okay? So one paper claimed that in order to combat rape culture and teach men how to respect women and be better feminists, we should train men like we train dogs. So this paper went through and made claims about monitoring dog rape statistics, and then basically talked about how in a dog park, there are dogs that rape other dogs, and if we can observe their behavior, we can learn about it, the way we train them not to rape other dogs, we can do that to men, and we can basically treat them like dogs. So that was one paper. That got published, and that was actually widely applauded by the journal. They put that in their 25th anniversary celebration tweet or whatever. This is a paper we're proud of publishing. Another paper says if a man is home, in the privacy of his own home, and he masturbates, thinking about a woman, okay, while thinking about a woman, he's masturbating, without her consent, without her knowledge, okay, that is a form of sexual violence. Actually, the paper goes to call it metasexual violence. So not only is actual sexual assault something that you should scorn and hate properly, but basically fuck crime. You know, if you think about a woman while you're masturbating, yeah, that's sexual violence too. Also published. Okay. Another paper talked about so-called fat shaming and body image stuff. So this comes out of the Grievance field of fat studies, which is ludicrous that that's an actual field, but it is. And this paper claimed that there's no such thing as a healthy body and an unhealthy body. That an unhealthy body, a fat body, it's arbitrary that we value muscle over fat. And so what we should do is create a new genre of bodybuilding called fat bodybuilding or obesity bodybuilding, and that we should celebrate people who are fat as, pioneers in this field. I mean, actually it's funny, you can make this stuff up because they did. But the fact that this is something that these fields believe is valid scholarship is very telling. I'll give you two more interesting ones here. Or three more. So one journal, Aphilia, accepted a paper where the authors took a chapter from Mein Kampf, which is Hitler's book, okay? A screed written against the Jews and basically advocating for collectivism of the German Aryan race, okay? They took that and they replaced all references to Jews with references to men. They took references of Aryans and replaced it with references to women or feminists. And they basically replaced some of the terminology with more modern buzzwords. So, the way they wrote in the 30s, the 1930s, is different from the way they write today. So they just modified it a little bit, and that got published. Okay? Another paper argued that if you're a white male in college, it's proper for you to be seated on the floor in chains, and you shouldn't be allowed to speak because that allows you to experience reparations and experience what it's like to be a slave or a minority. Again, accepted by the establishment, by the academic culture. The last one I'll talk about, men don't. This is another thing. This paper claimed that men tend, when they masturbate or pleasure themselves, they don't masturbate anally typically if they're straight heterosexual males. Why? Not because they are in any way biologically inclined to do it the way they do it. It's because they're really transphobic and misogynistic. They don't like women. They have this kind of old-fashioned view of what it's like to be a man. And so in order to make them understand women, be more feminist, and be less transphobic, what they should do is start masturbating anally with dildos. So again, it's hard for me to say this with a straight face because it's so ridiculous. But these are all a subset of the 20 papers that they submitted for publication. Not all of them made it, but it's telling. If you go through this article, and I'm going to link it in the show notes as well, they go through not just the thesis for each of the 20 papers. They provide excerpts of comments from the back and forth process where they had the peer review editor tell them what they should change and what they thought was good about the paper and what they thought was bad. And, in some ways, the comments from those editors are more telling than the actual paper themselves. It's like these people didn't take issue with the controversial aspects of this. They basically accepted it and had nitpicked things like the data or how the statistics were displayed or tallied or how it was phrased. And in some cases, they even said they weren't political enough. You would think they'd say be less political, be more scientific. Nope. The reviewers were saying be more political, be more in your face about it. So this is a very shocking development in one sense, and it's not shocking in another sense. So I'll tell you why it's shocking in one sense. It's shocking the degree to which they were able to get away with this and the degree to which this happened. I think this culture that we live in right now is pretty corrupt, but I didn't think it was this corrupt. I would think there would be some semblance of reason left at these journals. They wouldn't be able to function as peer-reviewed journals and maintain a straight face in the culture in academia if they were this bad. But it turns out they are this bad. Now, this isn't unprecedented. They're calling this whole thing, they call it so-called squared. And this comes from the fact that This idea of perpetrating an academic hoax isn't new. This was done in the 1990s. There was a physicist by the name of Sokal who basically published a paper in a postmodern journal, peer-reviewed postmodern journal, arguing that physics, the laws of physics, and particularly gravity, were social constructs, and that they were basically sexist. He wanted to see how bad it was at the time, and at the time that journal wasn't that respected. It wasn't that widely circulated. So even though it was widely lambasted, it was kind of seen as a fluke. It's like, okay, one paper gets through the cracks, not a big deal. In 2017, something similar happened. Someone wrote a paper, again, for a low-grade journal, arguing that penises cause climate change. The title of this paper was called "The Conceptual Penis." And again, this was something that people saw as a fluke, that, it was a low-grade paper. Maybe there was just, the person was asleep at the wheel. Nothing to say about academia per se, just something to say about that particular journal. Not so here. We're talking about on a massive scale, many journals having the same low standards, the same attitude, the same idea that if a paper is dubious in its methodology, as long as it conforms to your worldview and the view of your journal, the ideological message of your journal, it's okay, it should be validated, it's legitimate. So this is a very sad state of affairs. So in that sense, it's both surprising and not so surprising. Now, a couple things I want to talk about here, just real quick. So I had mentioned earlier in this video this idea of critical theory. Now, this actually comes, believe it or not, out of a philosophy known, the philosophy of a thinker named Immanuel Kant, who many of you may be familiar with, many of you may not be. Maybe you've heard the name, but you don't know who he was or what he believed in. So Kant was a German philosopher who wrote during the latter part of the 18th century. He basically was alive during the American and French revolutions. He was a professor of philosophy, and he's often associated with the Enlightenment tradition. But he is, in fact, I would argue, the first in a long line of thinkers that is actually anti-Enlightenment. He is the one who began an all-out intellectual attack on the ideas of the Enlightenment. Before Kant, the Enlightenment was a movement of intellectuals that believed that the real world exists and is knowable by the human mind, that we can actually go out and learn about reality through means of like science, through investigation, that our senses are basically valid. And there were skeptics at the time who basically, going back to ancient Greece, said that maybe your senses deceive you sometimes, maybe you can't know it 100%, but you can know it most of the way. Well, Kant basically put all that to rest by arguing not that your mind perceives reality, but that your mind, in a sense, creates reality. That your mind is furnished with these categories, these inbuilt mechanisms, and that essentially the senses that you possess take in this unintelligible muck of data, and it adds order to the data. So this idea that there are laws of physics, there's laws of chemistry, there's laws of biology, there's law of cause and effect. All of these things are ultimately, according to Kant, created by the human mind. They don't exist independent of the human mind. And so this is, not just skepticism. This is what philosopher Leonard Peikoff calls complacent skepticism. It's the idea that you can be totally skeptical of the outside world, about objectivity, and still function as a scientist. Now, Kant, by doing this, had split the world in half. Basically said there's two parts to the world. There's the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. The noumenal world is this unknowable world that you can't even process or even imagine. It could be that in the noumenal world, there's a god, there's free will, there's magic, supernatural stuff. We have no idea. All we can do is have faith about this world. It's pre-logical, it's pre-factual. It basically exists independent of us, but it's something we can never get to because our senses stand in the way. And that brings us to the phenomenal world, which is what our mind creates out of this flux, this muckety-muck of just random stimuli. Our brain adds order to it. And, of course, the natural outcome of this is, well, your brain orders it in one way, my brain orders it in another way. So, naturally, thinkers after Kant said, well, Maybe the state of your brain matters when you're taking the data and adding order to it. So that's where you get all these grievance studies departments who say that, well, women's brains maybe order it in one way. And minorities, like someone who's black, they may order it a different way. And a gay, well, they may order it totally differently from the other two. And so on, until eventually you have this balkanized field of every single person in society ordering reality in their own way. This idea that everyone has their own truth. Okay? So critical theory comes out of Kant's philosophy. Kant's philosophy is called the critical philosophy. That's actually its technical name. So all of these viewpoints, so for example, that science per se is sexist, or that there is a particular and peculiar feminine way of looking at reality, or a particular gay way of looking at reality, or a particular black way of looking at reality, that comes out of Kant's philosophy, and it's something that it's where we are today is a natural outcome of that philosophy being accepted and gaining prominence. So I realize this may be very abstract and beyond a lot of you as viewers, but it's something you should investigate, look into. I'm going to post a link to this article describing all these studies, and you should check it out. But it's something that I take issue with. It's something that's not objective, and it's ultimately incompatible with science per se, even though a lot of these people think they're doing science in these fields. So that's all I have for today in this episode. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this program. Feel free to comment, leave a like or a dislike, send me an email, hit me on Twitter. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.